Chapter 7. In no time at all, the travelers were within Hooksterdam's welcoming walls. They were greeted warmly by the Hookies, who had waited long for their coming, and quickly ushered off to hot meals in the chief's teepee. After finishing his bowl of soup, Rossley, ever curious about new surroundings, ventured out into the village to explore a bit, with his dog padding along at his heels. It was then that he encountered Leaf for the first time. They stood looking at each other, and at their feet, and at the ground, and at the sky, feeling quite awkward. They were about the same age, yes, and Morphin had urged his son to be hospitable. But it was about as difficult as you might expect for these two young boys from two different tribes, stumbling suddenly upon one another, to strike up a conversation. Finally, Leaf, the more naturally talkative one, began. "Hiya," he volunteered, rather doubtfully. Rossley glanced up, his hands still twisting themselves uneasily in Rocky's fur. "Hiya," he responded, unconsciously copying the Hookie dialect in a heroic attempt to be sociable. Well, the first step had been taken. Leaf glanced at Rocky. "That your dog?" Yes. "He's nice looking." "Thank you." "What's his name?" "Rocky." "Oh." In the flush of success at this brilliant progress, Leaf went blank as to what to say next. But while he stood pondering, he noticed that the other boy kept looking to the sky, as if he were searching for something. As another snowflake landed on Leaf's cheek, he said helpfully, "It's snowing." "I know." Rossley cocked an eyebrow at him, seeming to wonder whether this was an insult to his intelligence. "What were you looking for, then?" "Oh, my hawk." Leaf's mouth fell open a little. "Your what?" "Hold on a minute." Rossley took a small wooden pipe from his pocket. Raising it to his lips, and with the flick of his fingers across the pipe's 3 apertures, he let out several wild trills. Then he held out his left arm, around which was laced a leather arm guard. Leaf looked remarkably like a puppy, as, with his head cocked a little to one side, he stared with round, brown eyes at this strange behavior. A moment later, he had an immense surprise. There was a sound of rushing air, followed by a whir of wings, and with a shrill call, a hawk landed on Rossley's forearm. Leaf tumbled a few steps backwards. "Whoa! Hey, you better look out! That thing could hurt you! Look at them claws!" he gasped. Rossley grinned. "Oh, he's not hurting me. See? He landed on my arm guard. Besides, he's mine. He wouldn't hurt me for all the world." Slowly, Leaf drew nearer again. He's yours? No joke?" "Yes. I found him not long after he hatched, in the woods beyond my hamlet. I don't know what happened to his mother and father. They must have been shot by Terfungs. My people used to keep hawks back in the old days before things got tough, so I raised him." The prince stroked a finger across the majestic bird's breast. "He's been following me ever since I left the hamlet. I saw him waiting in the trees when I came out of the tunnels. I knew he would come." "What's his name?" Leaf asked, quite close now. "Valkyr. You can touch him if you like." "Will he murder me?" Leaf asked uncertainly, with another glance at the needle-sharp claws and the curved beak. "Of course not. Go on, scratch him, there, under the chin." Leaf, with a gulp, reached out and followed Rossie's instructions. Sure enough, Valkyr did not murder him. The Hookie boy gave a delighted chuckle. "Hey, I think he winked at me. He's pretty neat. Say, you want to go meet some of the other fellas? They'll never believe this." "Lead the way," Rossley said amiably. Thus, a historic friendship was born. The first snowfall, though quite deep, was a gentle, soft one, and Hooksterdam, with its many fires and its steaming kettles and sturdy, surprisingly watertight teepees, was a jolly place. The children, ever active and mischievous, frolicked wildly, ambushing their fellow villagers relentlessly with snowballs. But although everything seemed quite merry, Jason, Jane, and their counselors knew that their troubles were, indeed, beginning to multiply. Griffyngrein winters were long and tough, especially of late, and once they had begun, they did not usually let up much until late in the spring. Also, their tracks would be nearly impossible to cover, and travel would be much rougher. Jason tried to push aside the desperation beginning to build in his mind. He knew that for the short time he had been here, he had done his best and gained valuable allies, but he was pursued by the nagging feeling that he had not done enough, and the painful truth that, in reality, his forces were small and had little chance of survival against the enemy. There was so much more to be done. One day, with these thoughts heavy on his mind, he pushed open the flap to Rayneff's teepee. "Are you taking visitors?" he asked. Rainiff looked up with a glad face. Jason, come in, my boy. I was going to go looking for you today, but you have saved me the trouble. Sit down by the fire. No, don't worry about trekking in snow. Come in. Obediently, Jason settled down and sat watching the smoke drift through the teepee's apex above him, riddled with sparks dancing their wild, fleeting dance to and from the fire. Rainiff, who was huddled comfortably nearby with blankets around his shoulders, looked up from the bow shaft that he was carving to study Jason's face. Did you have something you wanted to speak with me about? Jason glanced up. Yes, he said after a moment. I'm trying to make a decision. This snow has ruined the plans I'd already made, but I've come up with a new idea that could solve the problem. But it's very risky. And what is this idea? Well, I know that at all costs we have to keep visiting the different peoples of Griffyngrein in hopes that they will join us, and I know that we're running short on time. The longer I delay, the more opportunity I give the Terrafunks to figure out what's happening. But we can't travel like we've been doing now with all this snow. Yes, I know. I've been puzzling on that as well. Jason nodded and looked at Rainiff keenly. What if I traveled alone? Rainiff paused in his work. What's that? I think I should go alone. It'd be much easier to get through the woods undetected by myself. I can move faster and be more flexible with changing routes on the fly, and make less of a ruckus than we do as a group, and I'd only have to look out for myself. It has been incredibly helpful having ambassadors and guides with me, and I can't say I feel very comfortable without them, but a single person can cover his tracks much easier. And should I get caught, there would still be Jane, and the Terrafunks wouldn't be able to put any of the blame for helping me on the Hookies or Ingers, like they would if they found ambassadors from those tribes with me. Rainiff was whittling again, his brow furrowed in thought. That might work. But, Jason, do you not think that you're a bit too important to be going on those sorts of missions alone? Not all of these people whom we must attempt to recruit are exactly reasonable or safe. There is a reason I sent you to the Hookies first and the Ingers second. They were the most civil and the easiest to convince. I know, but I've learned a lot over the past few months. I think I can take care of myself, and I think it would be good for my image to show up without a personal guard or people holding my hand through all of this. I'll show more independence and authority. It's hard enough to convey that message at my age already. Every bit helps, and these people need to trust Jane and me if we're going to pull this off. Rainiff nodded. That is a valid point. But I do worry about what the Allies will think. If I leave and take the sword with me, it will cause a lot of concern. And there's one other problem. I don't know my way around. Just then, Ezra thrust his head into the teepee and caught sight of Jason. There you are, he said. Sorry, am I interrupting? Jason threw up his hands in mock frustration. I hope you don't barge into everyone's teepee that way, he said as Rainiff beckoned the prince in. I try not to. But how does one knock on the door when there is no door? Ezra cast a baleful glance at the animal skin structure, a feature of Hooksterdam to which he was still very slowly getting accustomed. Rainiff laughed at them. You are welcome any time, Prince Ezra. His opinion would be helpful, Jason, he added. What were you talking about, if I may ask? Jason told him, and Ezra frowned in thought. I certainly see the advantages, he said, but there are drawbacks, too. Having Hookie representatives with you when you came to our hamlet was one of your greatest assets in my father's consideration. He's right, Rainiff said. The tribes of Griffyngrein may all be very different, and more isolated than ever in recent years, but their decisions, especially regarding pan-tribal matters, do influence one another greatly. Seeing representatives with you may be the key influencer on their trust in you. You are wise to consider how you might try to direct that trust more strongly towards you and Jane, but I don't think that is completely practicable. Jason nodded reluctantly. I understand. But what does that mean? Should I throw away this idea and try to think up something else? Frankly, no, Rainiff said. Even with the risk, it is the closest thing we have to a viable plan at the moment. Ezra cleared his throat. I have a suggestion. Just because you travel alone does not mean that you have to be the only one that travels. What do you mean? I mean that I will come with you, but I will leave at a different time and take a different route. In the end, I will be there for you as representative of the Ingers, and as an extra swordsman in case the mission goes sour. Jason's eyes brightened. That's not a bad idea, he said. And as far as finding my way goes, I can always take one of the toothed raptors with me. They leave no tracks and can fly for help if I get in trouble along the way. Aye, see? It's not so hard, Ezra said. Rainiff watched the two boys quietly, a mild smile in his eyes. Finally, he raised one last question. And what about Jane, Jason? You talked of traveling alone, but the two of you have the role of savior jointly. I know. I've talked to her about it a little. We've been thinking about taking turns, one of us taking a risk while the other one stays at headquarters, so that there's always one savior left should something happen. Rainiff stared thoughtfully at the fire and didn't speak. Jason looked at him curiously. Is there a problem? The old Griffin man finally looked up. I don't suppose so, he said reluctantly. Something within me is whispering warnings. There is something foreboding about this mission, but I do not know why. Jason shrugged a little impatiently. I have to have more than that to go on if I'm supposed to think up yet another plan. I know, Rainiff said with a sigh. Only whispers, nothing more. I hear them more often than not nowadays. All right, Jason said, getting up. I'll talk to Jane and finish sorting this out. Jason, wait, Ezra said as he started to leave. I have yet to even ask, where are we going first? Jason turned. His face was a trifle grim. To Kadaria. It's time to call on the kinfolk. Chapter 8. Kadaria, which, translated from the Griffyngrein tongue of a bygone era, literally means Little Aria, was once one of the greatest cities in Griffyngrein. In and around this city dwelt a large number of the kinfolk, who were so named because they were descended from those brave and sturdy settlers who had joined King Orowin in the founding of Griffyngrein many centuries ago, and were thus, in a sense, considered brothers and sisters of the kingdom itself. According to Rainiff, however, the kinfolk were sadly not much like their ancestors. Over time, extreme pride and a divisive spirit had spread and thrived amongst them, feeding on hard times and ancient prejudices. Despite their name, they did not consider themselves kin in an overarching sense. Instead, by painstakingly tracing their ancestry and obsessively preserving bloodlines, they had divided themselves into ranks and clans between which there was bitter strife. At the top of this wobbly social pyramid were the royals, who claimed to be relations, however distant, of the kings of Griffyngrein. Even amongst them there was great debate and some confusion as to who rightfully belonged to this class, for tracing the descendants of King Orowin and the accompanying line of sovereigns had grown quite complicated over 500 years. At any rate, they hardly deserved their title now. The line of King Orowin had been broken. King Ogland had failed in his reign 50 years ago. He had committed the sin which was destined to destroy his dynasty forever. Then he had been conquered. He had died in exile, childless and without any immediate family members to succeed him. Those who called themselves royals now were embarrassingly deluded in their royalty. But they had done their best to ignore the truth and to continue dominating the so-called lower classes, until some of those lower classes had quite enough. It was into this turbulent society that Jason, with many cautions from Rainiff, Morfin, and other advisers, was about to venture. It is no wonder that, from the outset, a dull but persistent foreboding weighed on his heart, echoing Rainiff's own instinctive concern. But this step, like all the others he had taken, was fully necessary, so he was determined to go through with it. They might be lacking in unity and nobility, but the kinsfolk, though concentrated around Kadaria, were to be found all over the kingdom as well, and were great in number. Perhaps it was he who would bring them all back together. But first he had to get through all the tedious arrangements for the journey. The sooner the better. He had been snowbound in Hooksterdam far too long. He set out in search for Jane as soon as he left Rainiff's teepee. He found her returning from the brook, where she had been gathering some sort of herb that grew along its banks. He walked back to the chief's teepee with her and explained the situation. He was finishing up his summary when they reached the door of the teepee. She turned, with a queer expression on her face, and fumbled nervously with the basket of herbs. Yeah, I'm fine with you going without me, she said, although I'd rather be with you, I think. What's wrong? Well, Mara's baby should be coming along any day now, and what? Jason prompted, a light beginning to dawn in his mind. Jane sighed. It seems that they're counting on me to perform the delivery. Jason's eyes widened, and he looked impressed. He gave a low whistle. Well, isn't that something? Jane shrugged sheepishly. I'm freaking out. The hookies all think I'm some sort of great physician just because I use my magical book to fix up their bangs and bruises, but delivering a baby? That's another thing entirely. Does your book tell you how to do that? Jason asked, beginning to feel that his mission was the easier one. Actually, it does. That's the only reason that I've agreed to it. The medical knowledge of these hookies is even cruder than the Ingers. Their healers only know the basics. Childbirth is disproportionately dangerous for them, even though they're a healthy tribe. They need help. And this book hasn't failed me yet. I think I can trust it. I agree. I think it'll go very well. You're good at this stuff. Better than I could ever be. Thanks, Jane exhaled. I hope to goodness you're right. Are you sure you're okay with me heading off without you? Yes. It's pretty clear what they need from me, and I've just got to roll with it. Go on and do your part, and I'll do mine. Just be careful. At daybreak the next morning, Jason slipped out of Hooksterdam, the gate clicking softly shut behind him. He was wearing almost every piece of clothing he owned, and had donned his tower cloak for a final layer of warmth. In his right hand, he carried a very curiously shaped bundle that was, in fact, his shield. It had been painstakingly wrapped up in old cloths. His sword and his belt were completely hidden by his outer layers of clothing. Jason's safety rested on his being inconspicuous as he journeyed through the forest, and the sword and shield were anything but that. As he predicted, the snow, even though it was only about 8 inches deep, made for physically taxing travel. He noticed with pleasure that it was dry, powdery snow, which allowed him to move quite soundlessly. But in the next moment, he also realized that it would allow anyone or anything else around him to move soundlessly too. With that in mind, he paused for a moment to make sure that he could easily reach his sword, and then pushed onward. A small bunch of icicles broke off the branch of a tree a little way ahead and fell, shimmering, into the snow. Jason glanced up and saw his Tooth Raptor guide, Quinnen, leap off the branch and flit to the next one, leading him onward. The city to which he was headed lay many miles to the north and east. Jason took as little rest as possible and sternly forced himself to move quickly despite the snow. He and the Toothed Raptor rarely spoke to one another. The faithful creature always stayed ahead and often circled around to check for enemies. All day he trekked on. By the time the sun was sinking behind the trees, he was intensely fatigued. But still he moved onward. The temperature dropped and became bitter, but there was nothing he could do except keep moving. Even if he were able to light a fire amidst all the snow, he would not have dared. The moonlight, weakened by a thin film of vapor, filtered down through the trees, providing just enough light for him to make out a few details of his surroundings. That faint light and the occasional soft calls of his guide were all that led him along. Around midnight, he was completely drained. His face seemed a block of ice, so numb and stiff that it felt oddly foreign to him. Even Quinnen was slowing down. He leaped clumsily from branch to branch, making strange hissing sounds through his long rows of teeth. Then something dreadful happened. Jason had to turn aside because an unusually dense cluster of brush blocked his way. Quinnen had obviously not perceived how impenetrable it was from above. Jason only needed to go a few steps out of his way to circumvent it, but that was all it took. The ground suddenly gave way under his right foot, and his legs slipped out from under him. He fell into a stream. It was only a shallow stream, nothing strong enough to pull him along in a current or suck him under, but it was enough to freeze him. The water knocked the breath out of him. He somehow got himself to scramble, coughing, out onto the opposite bank. Even as he did so, he felt as if 1,000 icicles were knifing him all over. The air was too bitterly cold. Hypothermia was going to overtake him very quickly. He staggered to his feet with no clear idea of what to do. Quinnen had discovered his deadly error and had swept back to his side, horrified. "Master Jason, thou must get to a fire," he croaked as loud as he dared. Jason tried to speak, tried to ask how far it was to Kadaria, but his whole system was numb. The Toothed Raptor helplessly followed him as he stumbled along, driven by nothing but dumb instinct. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of Jason, so close that he ran into it before he realized it was there. He fell with a gasp into the snow. The figure bent forward. It was nothing but a great black mass, silhouetted by moonlight. Jason tried to clamber backwards, pulling with his elbows, but the figure with one step reached his side, and in that motion blocked out all the light. After one short, horrible second, a flame flared up, and Jason found himself looking, through the opening of a hood, into the face of a man. Not some fantastic creature, after all. Only a man. This alone was a great comfort. It was hard to see his features well, but Jason made out a refined nose, black hair, and a pair of glitteringly sympathetic eyes. But he hardly gave a thought to the face. He was thinking about the torch that the man held. That small flower of fire seemed to be the very source of life to Jason, and involuntarily he held his hands close to it, even as he lay prostrate in the snow. "Hello. Are you all right?" asked the man kindly. What brings you out here alone on this bitter night? Upon my word, you are freezing. He pulled Jason to his feet. Come, I must get you to the fire. Jason had no idea where the fire was, but he didn't care. It was enough that it existed somewhere nearby. He limped along stiffly, supported by the black-cloaked man, who wasn't nearly as big and intimidating as he had first seemed. They had only progressed a few hundred feet when Jason saw a bright red-orange glow through a gaping window. Before them stood an old stone hut, like many scattered through Griffyngrein that Jason had seen in his travels. It was a bit crumbly, but filled with the light of that fire within, it looked quite glorious to him. In a few moments, he was inside the two-room hut, melting thankfully by the fire pit built into the center of the floor. Outside the broken window, Quinnen perched high in a tree and looked on with a great mixture of emotions. His master would not freeze to death now, but who was this man? He could not rest knowing that so much was hanging on Jason's personal safety and just as equally on his identity being protected. If the wrong person discovered he was carrying the sword... Suddenly Quinnen remembered. He had seen something on the forest floor, lying in the snow, as the man had helped Jason up and led him away. He hadn't paid it any mind at the time, with much bigger concerns crowding in upon him, but now instinct urged him to fly back and see what it was. He soon found the place where Jason had fallen, and sure enough, there were two bundles, half buried in the snow. Landing beside them, Quinnen peered at them closely, aided by a shaft of moonlight that was streaming down on him. He reached out a claw, carefully pulled back a bit of rag, and caught a glimpse of gleaming steel. It was the sword of the kingdom. The other bundle was undoubtedly the shield, and Quinnen saw the icy sword belt stretching through the snow underneath. "Clever lad," he murmured. Jason had undone the buckle in that one moment of darkness before the torch flared. His numb fingers had been forced into one last desperate precaution. Two of the kingdom's greatest treasures now lay alone in the dark and in the snow, and now, ironically, they were quite safe from discovery, if only for a little while longer. Quinnen snapped his teeth shut resolutely and pulled the rag back into place. He was much too small to carry either of these precious bundles. Instead, he pushed them along to the side of the path, where he swept thick layers of snow over them. Then he perched in a tree above them. He knew his duty. There was nothing he could do about Jason right now, and he couldn't fly for help. He must stay here and watch and wait, guarding the emblems of the kingdom's hope. Chapter 9. Jason was too exhausted to speak with the man much before falling asleep. He only thanked him repeatedly, and when the man asked him his name, told him it was Fields. Then he stretched out close to the fire and fell fast asleep. When he woke up, the sun had already risen. The fire was still burning, for the morning air was sharp, but the man was not in the hut. Jason got up, stretching, and looked around for a little while, but the house was very bare and offered little insight regarding its inhabitant. The man came through the back door, carrying an armload of firewood. "Ah, you are awake," he said, smiling. "Yes, and feeling much better. Thank you again for saving my life last night. I don't know how I can repay you." The man chuckled. "Not necessary, Fields. But where were you heading, if I may ask?" Jason was leaning out the window, searching the trees for Quinnen. He winced at the question and tried to think of a way to get around it. But deciding that such an attempt would look even more suspicious than a straight answer, given his lack of knowledge about the area, he turned away from the window and said, "To Kadaria, to visit friends. Actually, I need to go ahead and get moving." "Won't you stay and have breakfast with me?" the man urged. "No, thank you. They were expecting me last night, so I'm sure they're worried. I really appreciate your hospitality, though." The man handed him his many layers of clothing, which had dried by the fire overnight, and Jason quickly began to prepare for his journey. "Do you know how far it is to Kadaria?" he asked as he worked. "I've kind of lost my way with all of last night's excitement." "You are in luck. The city is only a few miles away, straight to the north," the man said. "I often visit Kadaria myself to purchase supplies." "Good," Jason said, throwing his cloak around his shoulders and fastening it in place. "I can make quick work of that." "That is a curious cloak you wear, Fields. It is quite a fine piece of clothing. I've never seen anything like it before. Where did you find it?" Jason shrugged. "A very generous friend gave it to me," he said. "I don't know where he found it originally, but yeah, it's something else, isn't it?" His host smiled. "Indeed." In a few minutes, Jason was ready and stood on the threshold of the hut. "One more thing," the man said. I would advise you, my friend, to carry a weapon with you the next time you traverse these woods. It is a dangerous place of late. Very dangerous." Jason nodded and gave a sheepish grin. "Yeah, my friends told me as much, but I was too cocky to listen. I'll take your advice, and theirs, next time." The man laughed. "Very well, then. Off with you, and travel safely. Perhaps we will meet again someday, Fields. Jason bowed. That would be great. Goodbye, and thank you. He set out briskly towards the north, and soon the trees closed in on him, hiding the stone hut and its lone inhabitant from view. Then he circled back around to find the place where he had left his sword and shield. As he went, he realized that he had never learned the man's name. Ah, Master Jason, Quentin croaked, flopping wearily but thankfully onto a branch near Jason's head. Such worrying have I endured all night. Hello, Quentin. I know, I'm really sorry for all this, Jason said, but I have to find my gear before we go on. Look no further, sire. I have been watching over them all night. I will take thee to them. Jason sighed with relief. Ugh, thanks. He dug his weaponry out of the snow. I'll have to make sure I clean them up as soon as possible, he said wryly. I'd look pretty stupid trying to lead an army with a rusty sword. Hush, master, don't talk so out here, the Tooth Raptor protested, looking around. Jason laughed. I didn't shout at Quentin, but fine, I won't. He brushed off as much snow and ice as he could before buckling the belt back around his waist. It was probably a stupid thing to do. What was stupid? Leaving these here. It's just that things seem so much worse in the dark, especially when you're dying, he added dryly. He glanced in the direction of the hut at the set of tracks he and the cloaked man had made last night. He was harmless, after all. Taking all those precautions seemed over the top this morning. I should have eaten breakfast with him, too. I'm starving. I just can't help but be extra careful. Quentin frowned doubtfully. I think it was wise. Jason shrugged. Well, come on. The man said that Kadaria was several miles to the north. Hopefully we can reach it by midday. The last few miles were uneventful, and Jason, renewed by his rest even though he was very hungry, moved along steadily. It was a typical cloudy winter day, but not terribly cold. At about 11 o'clock, they found a real road, a very rare occurrence for a traveler in Griffyngrein in those times. Though ill-kempt and snow-covered, it was a welcome change, and the going became easier. As they journeyed along this road, they began to pass more stone huts, but these did not look so abandoned. Once, Jason saw several figures whisk out of view behind one of the buildings, and he often imagined hostile, suspicious eyes watching him intently from the various windows. But fixing his own eyes straight ahead, he moved onward. Finally, he saw the city. Like the ruined capital of Griffyngrein where the tower stood, Kadaria spread over a broad, gently sloping hill. A great stone wall surrounded it, but it had been broken down in several places and did not seem very useful now. Through the gaps, Jason caught glimpses of the city within. Everything, the wall, the buildings, the streets, was built from the same kind of gray stone. The buildings that rose above the wall varied wildly in height, but none of them were as tall as the tower. The road on which Jason walked led up the hill to the main entrance. On either side of this entrance, the wall curved out away from the city to meet the oncoming visitor, gradually sloping downward for about 80 feet until it leveled off with the ground itself. The walkway in between was not very broad. Evidently, carts and wagons must enter through a different gate. As Jason drew nearer, he saw, through the main entrance, people bustling around with the usual energy of city life. This sight was a relief, for from a distance, the city had looked abandoned, ruined, dead. Before he was too close, he took one last comprehensive look and tried to picture the city in the days of prosperity, wealth, and grandeur. Yes, once it must have been very handsome. Now it was very dull and very gloomy. He was within the entrance walls now. Quentin flew up to the top of the right-hand wall and moved along it, carefully watching all that happened down below. The gate was wide open, and citizens occasionally issued forth, shuffling along in dark, shabby attire. They looked sullenly at Jason out of the corners of their eyes as they brushed past him, but none stopped to question him. He wondered if the kinfolk had ever gotten the message that he had sent by Tooth Raptor, telling them he was coming. He was about to pass into the city when a big, surly-looking man, who had been leaning against the wall right by the entrance, smoking, looked closely at him and suddenly stalked over to meet him. "Hang on a minute there," he demanded. "Who are you?" I am Jason Fields," he answered with as much dignity as he could muster, considering the smoke that the man was breathing into his face. "I have come to—" "Hold it! You just wait right here, and I'll fetch Gutschner." Jason frowned. "All right," he said, not very appreciative of the welcome. The man stumped off, stopping once to look back at Jason, blowing out a cloud of smoke as he did so. "Just wait here," he reminded him. "I know, I'm waiting." The man turned his broad back on him and disappeared down one of the narrow streets. Jason looked up to catch a glimpse of Quentin's beak, where he crouched on top of the wall. He raised his eyebrows at the toothed raptor. "So far, so good," he mumbled. As he waited for the big man's return, he slipped his hand under his cloak and began discreetly loosening the rags around the sword of the kingdom, preparing to display it as proof, like always. As he did so, he became aware that a small crowd, made up of mostly dirty, bewhiskered, questionable-looking men, were beginning to gather. Some stood several yards within the entrance, while others came closer, standing against the walls on either side of Jason. Still others now stood behind him. Jason swallowed and worked a little quicker on the rags. At last, the big man returned, but he was following, not leading, the man whom he had gone to fetch. This man was shorter than the first, but built just as broadly, if not broader. He stomped along using a great club, broadside downward, as a sort of walking stick, though he didn't seem to need it. His clothes were soiled and ragged and dark, like those of his companions, and his expression seemed caught in a permanent sneer. But what was strikingly bizarre about him was his hair. It was cut in a sort of wide mohawk, and was an extraordinary shade of red. As he drew close, Jason could easily see that it had been dyed this color, for, first of all, it was of an obviously unnatural hue, and second of all, his unshaven facial hair was brown. The effect was obnoxious, and greatly contributed to his overall brazen, incongruous manner. He reached Jason and stood almost nose to nose with him. "Hello, pretty boy," he sneered. "You came here looking for attention, it seems, and now you've got mine. What do you want? Why are you here?" Jason squared his shoulders. "I am Jason Fields. Did you not get the message that I sent to you by a toothed raptor the day before yesterday?" Gutschner snorted. "Oh, I got a message, all right, but the language was so flowery I thought I'd give you a chance to repeat yourself in person. Just who do you claim to be?" Jason forced himself to stay patient. "Fine. Here it is, plain and simple. I am the savior of Griffyngrein. I was called here by magic and proven legitimate by the tower test, and I have not only the blessing of Griffyngrein's greatest tribes, but also the sword of the kingdom." He drew the weapon from its sheath and held it out in all its glory, its hilt resting on one hand and the blade on the other, between him and Gutschner. "I've come to seek the allegiance of the kinfolk." Gutschner glanced carelessly at the sword, and then, smirking, stared at Jason. Suddenly, he struck Jason across the face. Jason, wholly unprepared for the heavy backhand, staggered backwards a little. His foot caught on the edge of a loose paving stone, and he fell to the ground, the sword clattering noisily at his feet. The crowd laughed roughly. Jason, his face stinging, felt sick with shock. Half blind with fury, he sprang to his feet to fling himself at his assailant, but before he could even begin, a sweeping blow from the big club knocked him down again. Gutschner stood over him as he lay trying to catch his breath, wheezing, clutching his side where the club had smashed into his rib cage. The man's face was distorted with a gleeful sort of hate. "That's right. Lie still a moment and let your grand plans bleed out of you, filthy little mouse," he snarled. "Think about how easy that was for me, oh savior of Griffyngrein." Squatting down, he grabbed Jason's collar, pulling him up to look him eye to eye. "Know this, Jason Fields. There is no savior of Griffyngrein. None. Never. There's no power in an old sword. Bah! It's the stuff of weak children's stories and blasted fairy tales. It's all treachery and trash. Mark my words, this is the last time that anyone strolls into my city claiming to be savior. Do you hear me? The last time!" He let Jason drop and stood up, glaring around ferociously at the crowd. "We get revenge on the Terrafungs this time. We show 'em we won't be deceived by any more of these dogs." He kicked Jason as he finished. The men cheered raucously, brandishing their fists. Gutschner whirled around. "Potter, throw him in prison and let him rot. The rest of you, round up the men. We've got work to do tonight, with steel and fire." Noisily the men tramped off. Jason was hauled away. The sword of the kingdom lay on the stone-paved walkway. Once, as one of the thugs passed it, he picked it up, apparently to see if he could make use of it, but it was too heavy, and his back bent with the weight. Grunting in disgust, he dropped it roughly to the ground, where it lay in the dusty gutter, abandoned.